Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. It's been 2 months since Hurricane Helene devastated western North Carolina in the region's worst natural disaster in modern history. Since then, the state's recovery efforts have become bogged down by political infighting. That's a contrast from Washington, where the federal government's efforts have remained mostly above the partisan fray. WRAL state government reporter Will Doran has been tracking the storylines in Raleigh and Washington, and he joins us now. Will, thanks for being here.
Good to see you, Jack.
Before we begin, we're recording this episode before the Thanksgiving holiday, so there may be some new developments in this storyline. For the latest, go to the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. Will, to help frame this, could you just break down the scope of destruction North Carolina suffered from Helene?
Yeah, it's hard to even put into words. If you haven't been out there and seen, the mud slides everywhere, it's hard to imagine. But this was, by several factors, the most damaging storm ever in recorded history here in North Carolina. Over 100 people died. It did around $53 billion in damages, according to state estimates. For contrast, that broke the record set in 2018 by Hurricane Florence, which did $17 billion in damages. So, obviously there's been a little bit of inflation since then, but certainly not, triple. So yes, by any measure that you look at it, this is, certainly one of the worst, if not the worst, natural disaster ever to hit North Carolina.
And since the storm, state lawmakers have approved quite a bit of funding for victims of the storm. How much have they set aside?
Yeah, they have spent around $877 million so far. So just under $900 million. Governor Cooper has suggested a plan that would be about a $4 billion spending plan for state government. Obviously $900 million is only a tiny portion of that, but GOP leaders have said, look, we're not done. We do plan to keep moving forward with spending plans. This is probably going to be something that we do here in state budgets for years to come, dole out money here and there as new needs and issues arise for this Helene relief aid.
Now, Cooper is a Democrat. The legislature is run by Republicans. Natural disasters have a way of bringing people together, but that hasn't always been the case here on the ground or on Jones Street, right?
Yeah. There has been a longstanding fight over, the Cooper administration's handling of response to Florence, which I mentioned a moment ago, and also to Hurricane Matthew. It's been years and still not everyone's homes who were destroyed in those storms are back together. And so that has been a big political issue here. We saw after Helene, people really did come together. There were two different times that the legislature came in, passed a relief bill, passed unanimously, got, big applause. Everyone kind of patted each other on the back on both sides of the aisle, got up. Lawmakers from Western North Carolina, both Republicans and Democrats, spoke about how important this aid was and how happy they were to see their colleagues banding together to get this region some funding. But now here we are 2 months later, and that has not happened. The legislature has passed a Helene relief bill that also includes a number of unrelated provisions stripping power away from the governor, the attorney general, the superintendent of schools, the lieutenant governor, which are all offices that were won by Democrats in this November's elections. And Governor Cooper just vetoed that bill. He said it is a sham. It does not do nearly enough for Helene relief aid. In fact, he said it does basically nothing for Helene relief aid, and it just uses that as a pretense to enact these power grabs that he calls unconstitutional. So what could have been another opportunity for state lawmakers to pat each other on the back and get some funding approved was not. It had all these poison pills that were put into it that has really kind of broken down and just, laid bare the political fighting behind the scenes in Raleigh on so many things.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll find out what federal lawmakers are doing for Helene victims. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL state government reporter Will Doran about the political battle over fighting for victims of Hurricane Helene. Will, I want to dive deeper into the rift here at the state level. Republicans have been critical of recovery efforts led by Democrats, and now we're going to see some management change there. Tell us about what happened.
Yes, there we have a state office called the Resilience and Recovery, sometimes also called Rebuild NC, but it is in charge of basically getting the FEMA money to homeowners here in North Carolina. And it has just been, as I mentioned earlier, just beset with problems for years. And, the Cooper administration has said, oh, no, the problems are, largely due to FEMA. Republican state lawmakers here have said, no. Other states have also gotten hit with hurricanes and have not taken 6+ years to build a home. This is on you. And so what we saw just days ago was Laura Hogshead, who has been leading that program for the past few years, forced out, announcing her resignation. And that came just after the state legislature hauled her in to testify under oath in an oversight committee about problems with this. And as Republicans defended the relatively low level of spending that we saw in that most recent Helene bill that also had the power grab provisions, they said, look, we don't trust this agency with even $1. The fact that we're willing to give it anything is, just because we don't want to punish people who are the victims of these storms. But we think that, if it were up to us in a perfect world, we wouldn't be giving these people any money because we don't think that they are accountable or good at their jobs. And so right after that happens, she's out. And of course, in just, 6 weeks, Josh Stein will be sworn in as governor, and he's going to have the opportunity to try to remake that agency. He can now hire someone to lead it since there's a vacancy at the top. He can outline ways that he wants to see it change. And we spoke with the new incoming Speaker of the House, Destin Hall, who said that he does expect to see, I think the quote was, wholesale reform to this group, NCORE, Rebuild NC. Really, Republicans have been on this for years. And all the problems that it's seen in Eastern North Carolina, they've said, okay, we need to know that this group can be better now that we're also looking at problems in Western North Carolina that need to be resolved. And that's going to be issues for the new generation of state leadership starting in 2025 to tackle.
Now, meanwhile, Democrats are criticizing Republicans for their spending priorities throughout this whole thing, right?
Exactly. Like I said, Cooper has proposed about a $4 billion plan. The Republican legislature has approved less than $900 million. So they're very off on their numbers. And we saw actually the same day that the legislature voted to approve the latest Helene bill, which had a couple $100 million, but most of which would stay unappropriated, unspent. So they just kind of shuffled some money around between savings reserves, but without actually sending it towards something. The same day they did that, they also voted to spend several $1 billion over the next decade on private school tuition vouchers. And that includes, $400 million alone just next year. And so Democrats said, look at this. You have all these hundreds of millions, billions of dollars that you're pumping into private schools. And by the way, the reason that we need this money for these private school vouchers is because we just opened up the rules to allow wealthy families to apply. So they said you're literally subsidizing millionaires instead of giving aid to people in Western North Carolina. And we asked Senate Leader Phil Berger about that. He defended the decision. He said, look, the vouchers has been something that Republicans have campaigned on for years. This was a promise that we made to our supporters. We feel that we need to fulfill this promise that we made. We can do it. And we think that we can do both. We've planned on doing the vouchers. We didn't plan, obviously, for Helene, but he said Republicans, through their stewardship of the state economy, state government, have created a large savings reserve that they have been drawing down from for Helene funding and will continue to over the coming years.
Now, while state lawmakers are duking it out in Raleigh, federal lawmakers are also debating funding in Washington. What's Congress considering?
Yeah, that is the key question here, because even as, the state squabbles over, okay, should we spend, $1 or $2 billion? Should we spend $4 billion? No matter what they end up on, the federal government is going to be the entity that's providing the vast majority of relief aid. And that's not just the case for Helene in North Carolina. That's the case with every natural disaster in modern U.S. history. That's how it works. And so the federal government has not put aside any additional funding for natural disasters in a couple of years. And so President Biden has put forward a $100 billion plan. And that's not just for North Carolina. That would go to around a dozen states that were hit by Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Milton, Hurricane Debbie, some other storms, even as far away as Alaska, some tornadoes in the Midwest. So $100 billion, across a dozen states, then, the money starts to look smaller and smaller and smaller. Governor Cooper has said that North Carolina needs $25 billion from the federal government for recovery in Western North Carolina. So obviously, if you've got $100 billion going to a dozen states, North Carolina wants $25 billion, that means Congress is going to need to approve even more that Biden has suggested. And so that is what we're going to be watching over the next couple of weeks as to what Congress decides to do.
And you report that the political situation there has been a little bit less fraught than in Raleigh, right?
Correct. Part of it is that there is a little bit of urgency with Congress. We will hit a government shutdown on December 20th unless they pass a new spending bill, and I don't think anyone wants to shut down the government at Christmas and as Republicans are about to head into a trifecta of control in D.C. with, incoming President Trump. Republicans are going to have both the House and the Senate. I don't believe that they want to have sort of the embarrassment of shutting the government down right before they come in and take over and tell people that they can govern. So there seems to be a lot of momentum to get this spending bill done. When Democrats, currently have the presidency and the Senate, Republicans control the House right now, but a lot of the areas that this funding would go to, reporters up in D.C. have noted, are areas that are represented by Republicans. So even though this is a plan that is put together by a Democratic president, goes to lots of red states like here in North Carolina. So there has actually been a lot of bipartisan support for this idea.
Now, state lawmakers returned to Raleigh this week. What are they expected to do?
They could override Governor Cooper's veto of the Helene bill, and that would, is at least as far as the Helene issues go, would free up that little under $300 million that they set aside to just be transferred essentially from one savings fund to a different savings fund to be spent at a later date. The main thing in that bill is all of the issues aimed at taking powers from the governor and the attorney general and the other offices. But it's unclear if they've got the numbers to do that. So far, since Republicans have had the supermajority starting last year, they've been able to override all of Cooper's vetoes. They only have the supermajority by the exact lowest number of seats needed, but they've been able to do it because there's been no defections from the GOP on a lot of these bills. But what we saw just a few days ago when this bill passed the House, there were 3 Republicans from Western North Carolina areas that got hit hard by Helene who voted against this. And this came as critics were saying that this does not do nearly enough for aid out in Western North Carolina. Now, we heard that mostly from Western North Carolina Democrats saying that this doesn't do enough. The Republican defectors who voted with the Democrats, none of them explained their vote. So we don't know exactly why each of them made that decision, but the fact remains there are 3 Republicans that House leadership needs to get all 3 of them back on board if they want to be able to override Cooper's veto. So that is going to be very interesting to see if they can get those members back on board.
And what does this process look like in January after Democrats have a little bit more power in the legislature?
Yes, Democrats broke that GOP supermajority, so they're not going to be able to just depend on a party line vote in the future to override Cooper's veto or to override Josh Stein's vetoes once Josh Stein is the governor starting in January. So that gives him more leverage on negotiating budgets, negotiating any sort of policy bill, anything that comes up at the legislature. And, that could also mean that we don't see further instances like this where you have Helene funding, but it gets tied to all of these other provisions that Democrats are against, because it would be more likely that a veto would actually stand. You could see what politicians like to call a clean bill that only does what it claims to do and doesn't have a lot of tricky issues built into it.
Well, I know you're going to be watching very closely, as always. Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
That's WRAL state government reporter Will Doran for his story on the battle for Helene funding in Washington and Raleigh. Go to the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.